you can listen to The Front on your smart speaker every morning. To hear the latest episode, just say, play the news from The Australian.
From The Australian, here's what's on the front. I'm Claire Harvey. It's Friday, August 2. Israel has declared it's eliminated a top Hamas commander. Mohammed Deif, an alleged planner of the October 7 massacre of civilians in Israel, died in a July airstrike, part of Israel's ferocious siege of Gaza. Deif is the third high-ranking Israeli target to die in 48 hours, after assassinations in Lebanon and Iran. Former Chief of Army Peter Leahy is warning Australia is now a strategic liability to the United States. Leahy says Australia's military is stretched too thin and unprepared to fight at short notice. That's an exclusive live for our subscribers right now at theaustralian.com.au. JD Vance, the man who wants to be America's next vice president, turns 40 today. So, how did a man who was once a very outspoken critic of Donald Trump become Trump's running mate? And who is the real JD Vance? That's today on The Front. Let's go back for a moment to the 2016 election campaign. Republican candidate Donald Trump is considered an outside chance, even a bit of a joke. But there's a movement on, a group of people who are angry, extremely vocal and very pro-Trump. Hillary Clinton calls them a basket of deplorables.
Right? The racist, sexist, homophobic, xenophobic, Islamophobic, you name it.
They're mostly just working-class white Americans. JD Vance, a little-known author, thinks he might have some answers about why they love Donald Trump.
Fundamentally, what's going on and what Donald Trump has done is change the focus of the white working class from a sort of engaged and constructive politics to a politics of pointing the finger.
That's Vance, who just published an autobiography about growing up poor in the Midwest, talking to journalist Charlie Rose.
I'm a never Trump guy. I never liked him. The problem is, if you take that attitude of sort of gloating over Trump's defeat, then you're playing into the very thing that gave rise to Trump in the first place, which is a feeling that the elites think that they're smarter than you.
And now,
former President Donald Trump announcing he has chosen Ohio U.S. Senator JD Vance as his running mate on his...
The never Trump guy, well, he's changed his tune.
For the last 8 years, President Trump has given everything he has to fight for the people of our country. He didn't need politics, but the country needed him. Now, prior to running for president, he was one of the most successful businessmen in the world. He had everything anyone could ever want in a life. And yet, instead of choosing the easy path, he chose to endure abuse, slander, and persecution. And he did it because he loves this country.
So, who is the real JD Vance? Nick Jensen is the opinion editor at The Australian. Nick, first of all, JD Vance turns 40 today. He's a millennial. So how much does that matter when we think about his political significance?
I think it's extremely important because in so many ways, the way in which JD Vance is discussed is through the prism of Trump and him being a kind of MAGA heir, if you like. But I think he represents so much more. I think the millennial aspect really can't be underestimated. I mean, if you think about some of the things he stands for, so just to run through a couple of them, you know, he's skeptical about stock markets. He's skeptical about big tech companies. He's keen on tariffs. He's keen on minimum wages, even labour unions. Not only is it unlike Trump 1, but it's actually quite unlike the Republican Party of recent years. It's about labour and not capital. And I think a lot of these issues are things that millennials on the left and right can find some appeal in.
Hillbilly elegy really for many people after the election who are wondering how Trump rose, the book was kind of like a manual, wasn't it? This is why.
So it's, in the first instance, a remarkable story, his story of childhood trauma. But it's exactly that. It's a guidebook, isn't it? About how you can kind of improve your lives. And it's also a guidebook or a kind of history of the complexities of this working class rage that has been there amongst the kinds of people he's grown up with, that has raised him, that, you know, they've been sold a pup as far as they're concerned. The American dream is broken. It doesn't work with them. Their jobs have gone, wages stagnated, and the kinds of Rust Belt ruins in which they live, just nothing works anymore.
So I didn't write this book because I've accomplished something extraordinary. I wrote this book because I've achieved something quite ordinary, which doesn't happen to most kids who grow up like me.
This is JD Vance narrating part of his book, Hillbilly Elegy.
The statistics tell you that kids like me face a grim future, that if they're lucky, they'll manage to avoid welfare, and if they're unlucky, they'll die of a heroin overdose. Whatever talents I have, I almost squandered until a handful of loving people rescued me. That is the real story of my life, and that is why I wrote this book.
In the wake of the publication of that book, JD Vance became a literary celebrity. He was on every talk show talking about, explaining the white working class for the insiders, really. And he was incredibly harsh about Donald Trump, wasn't he?
He was. He even compares him to Hitler, I think, at one point. So he's by no means a Trump fan. And I think this is where he's come in for criticism from the Republicans and the Democrats, is this guy devoted to this grand cause that he sets out in Hillbilly Elegy, or is he actually a political chameleon who has used his cunning and backed in Trump in order to elevate his own political ambitions?
He has said since accepting the vice presidential nomination that Trump's brilliance as president changed his mind. Yeah. And it's okay for people to change their minds, of course. That's what happened to him. So he hasn't really repudiated his previous views about life or about America, has he? It's more his views about Trump.
Absolutely. I think the vision that JD Vance has just adds a new layer to Trumpism. He's modernising it. So we already know that the kind of core tenets of Trumpism is part of the JD Vance story. In fact, as we're saying, it's probably built out of it as a kind of core text or guidebook, as you say. But there's new aspects to it. Some of the things that I was just listing before about being sceptical about stock markets and labour over capital. I mean, this is a whole new intellectual aspect in politics that's happening on the right. And in fact, they're calling it the new right. Now, that, of course, predates Vance, but I don't think we've ever really seen someone who's so absolutely embodies this kind of new movement quite like him.
Do you think he's charming?
I think he's polished. I think he's sharp. I think he's very focused. I think he's aggressive. I think his story makes him compelling. I wouldn't describe him as charming or charismatic, to be honest.
Coming up, the story of JD Vance evolves as he becomes part of the Republican political machine. So, how does he handle his own history? And speaking of evolving stories, make sure you go to theaustralian.com.au. Our subscribers get all the best news and analysis from here and around the world 24/7. Now to the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee, 2024. Trump's new running mate, JD Vance, takes the stage. He talks about Donald Trump, about his history, about his vision for America. But the person who stole the show wasn't even there to see it.
I was lucky. Despite the closing factories and the growing addiction in towns like mine, in my life, I had a guardian angel by my side. She was an old woman who could barely walk, but she was tough as nails. I called her Mamaw, the name we hillbillies gave to our grandmothers. Now, my Mamaw died shortly before I left for Iraq in 2005. And when we went through her things, we found 19 loaded handguns. They were stashed all over her house, under her bed, in her closet, in the silverware drawer. And we wondered what was going on, and it occurred to us that towards the end of her life, Mamaw couldn't get around so well. And so this frail old woman made sure that no matter where she was within arm's length of whatever she needed to protect her family. That's who we fight for. That's American spirit.
This is the JD Vance of today, a man who's honed his personal story into a sharp political weapon.
Why he's such a compelling figure is the narrative, which is obviously what runs like electricity through Hillbilly Elegy, is so powerful. I mean, it's embedded in him. You saw it in the Republican National Convention speech. It's all there. And so it makes him such a powerful figure to draw on that. I think one of the moving moments in the Republican National Convention recently was when JD Vance's mother, Beverly, who we know led a life of extreme dysfunction and abuse and addiction, she stood in the crowd and people applauded her.
I'm proud to say that tonight my mom is here, 10 years clean and sober. I love you, Mom. And you know, Mom, I was thinking it'll be 10 years officially in January of 2025. And if President Trump's okay with it, let's have the celebration in the White House.
And she's part of the kind of reform, the personal reform that he's advocating. It's a pretty remarkable story.
Especially when American politicians have really hidden the dark things about their families forever.
Absolutely. And we're talking about serious dysfunction. I mean, for those who haven't read Hillbilly Elegy or watched the film, I mean, we're talking about relatives setting each other on fire. We're talking about suicide attempts. We're talking about, driving cars off the road. And it's a really intense story of childhood trauma kind of at the heart of it, the kind of a more intimate look at it.
Yeah, and JD Vance at the centre of it is an incredibly vulnerable little figure. This little boy who just desperately wants his mother's love, has to deal with a string of kind of stepfather figures who come through the family and ultimately relies on Mamaw, his grandma, to be the force of stability in his life.
Mamaw was in so many ways a woman of contradiction. She loved the Lord, ladies and gentlemen. She was a woman of very deep Christian faith. But she also loved the F word. Now, she once told me, when she found out that I was spending too much time with a local kid who was known for dealing drugs, that if I ever hung out with that kid again, she would run him over with her car. That's true. And she said, JD, no one will ever find out about it.
She's a remarkable character in the story, isn't she, the grandmother? I mean, but for her, I think she's probably the most decisive figure in the childhood, isn't she? Because she is the person that insists on the kind of inner dignity of people whose lives have gone wrong or not in the way they expected. And she really drives home to him that personal responsibility is really the only antidote for him to improve his life, to become someone, and to move away from all the dysfunction and suffering.
So is JD Vance a Republican as we've come to know them, the grand old party, or is he something new in politics?
Well, I think this is the thing. Like, on the one hand, it's difficult to judge because he seems like this totally new figure and he says things that seem totally shot through with contradiction and paradox in terms of what we think of as the Republican Party, which I think basically just means a kind of Reaganite consensus, free market and so on. Is he part of this whole new era of there are no distinctions of left and right in politics, that all those taxonomies have gone away and now new things need to be built, new ideas need to be forged?
A former friend of his named Sophia Nelson Sophia's a transgender woman and public defender who once had a close relationship with JD Vance. She's leaked dozens of decade-old emails that the pair of them exchanged, and she talked about him on CNN.
What I've seen is a chameleon, someone who is able to change their positions and their values depending on what will amass them political power and wealth.
He reveals himself as someone who's very thoughtful about the kinds of things that I think he would now say are left liberal elite obsessions. You know, he's being very thoughtful about the gender identity of this person who he's friends with. He's completely accepting of her. He, in fact, apologises for having described her in Hillbilly Elegy as gay, which he realises perhaps not the way she would choose to describe herself.
So the JD Vance that I was friends with for over a decade was compassionate, and we frequently disagreed. But he always approached conversations with respect and kindness. And what we've seen with Donald Trump is a callousness and a cruelty in the way he talks about people, a bullying, right? He's a bully and he calls people names. And when JD decided to run for the Senate in 2022, he started adopting that similar persona, so anathema to who he used to be.
The JD Vance of today is bombastic. He isn't afraid to offend people or start fights. Here he is talking to Tucker Carlson in 2021.
We're effectively run in this country via the Democrats, via our corporate oligarchs, by a bunch of childless cat ladies who are miserable at their own lives and the choices that they've made, and so they want to make the rest of the country miserable too.
He hasn't apologised for those comments, by the way, but he did recently make this clarification.
I've got nothing against cats, I've got nothing against dogs, I've got one dog at home and I love him. The substance of what I said, I'm sorry, it's true.
That brings us to the big question about JD Vance. Was he telling the truth about himself back then and now he's pretending to be someone else? Or was he pretending to be someone else back then and now we see the real JD Vance?
I mean, there's people on both sides that are very clear on what they think about that. I don't know. I mean, clearly political opportunism and changing one's character and even values is always going to be a thing in politics. Quite whether he's changed them to such an extent in order to be Trump's running mate, and it's difficult to say. I think one thing that is revealing, though, is that when he defeated Tim Ryan, a Democrat and longtime Ohio representative for the seat in Ohio, Trump endorsed Vance in that election, helping him win during a crowded election cycle. Now, it's quite clear without Trump's support, there's no way JD Vance would have been in this position.
If Trump loses this election, do you think that will be the end of JD Vance's career, or can he execute another 180?
I don't know. But I think one thing is for sure. You mentioned the Republican establishment. I think if JD Vance goes on to become vice president, and who knows, maybe even president, it's possible, it will forever change the right in the US. So in some ways, JD Vance is kind of more consequential than Trump because of some of those add-ons, because of that new intellectual background, because of the millennial aspect. I think JD Vance is here to stay. And also, happy birthday.
Nicholas Jensen is The Australian's opinion editor. If you'd like to read some more of our wildly varying analysis and opinion about the US election and more, head to theaustralian.com.au. Thanks for joining us on The Front. Our team is Joshua Burton, Stephanie Coombs, Leah Tsamaglu, Jasper League, Tiffany Dimmack, Kristen Amiot and me, Claire Harvey.